Now that the feet are done, it's time to start building the form for the legs. These will be made out of lightweight concrete. What we're looking at here is the base of the form. All of the pieces that make up the form will be assembled to this base. This top face will actually be one side of the leg. The base was made from low-quality leftover boards from other projects. The top face is actually leftover siding. The top face is going to have to be filled in and sealed because it is actually one side of the leg. The bottom structure is there to make sure the face of the form stays flat. Cutting the two sides on my crosscut sled. These boards must extend 2 inches above the face because the leg is going to be 2 inches thick. They will also need to be a little bit longer than the base because the ends are going to have to move against them. The legs are going to be 2 inches thick, so I'm going to need some spacers that are 2 inches thick so that I can be sure that the sides and ends are all the same height above the base. I will be cutting these spacers from a scrap 4x4 that I salvaged off of an old bedpost using my miter saw. I'm using a scrap board marked at 2 inch for my test cuts. I need to do this because I don't have much of that 4x4 available to cut the spacers. The first cut was about a 30-second over, so we're going to make a second cut to get it down to 2 inches. But the length of scrap was too short to make a safe cut, so we had to go get another piece of scrap. On the miter saw, the piece must engage both backstops or the part's going to be pulled into the blade when it makes its cut, causing some serious problems. And now that we're set, we whack off the 4 spacers I need to assemble the form. The purpose of the spacers are to set the height of the sides and ends, but how am I going to use them to set the height of the sides and ends? The sides and ends are going to be screwed onto the side of the base. And you can see here how the spacers are going to have to set the height of the side. It would be very difficult to attempt to clamp everything in place to do this and keep everything at the same height. So I'll be flipping the base over and setting it on top of the spacers, and then with the sides against the sides of the base and against the workbench, screw them in place. But for this, I'll need to move things over to my other workbench because this one is no longer a level surface and cannot control the height properly. But first, I'm going to have to clean up that carpenter's bench and get the miter saw out of the way. In my shop, there are a few tools that don't have a permanent home, and one of them is the miter saw. When it is in use, it sits on the end of my carpenter's bench. But when I need the full length of the carpenter's bench, I need to get it out of the way. I used to just pick it up and put it on the ground, but that was a bit of a pain, and then it becomes a trip hazard. Then I came up with an idea that is convenient and also makes it readily available. That yellow-green rope just above it that's hooked into a carbiner, and it goes up through a pulley into the joist that's on the ceiling. Hooking the carbiner on the handle of the saw, I grab the rope, pull it up to the joist, and then there's a hook screwed into the joist that hooks into the carbiner, and my bench is now fully in use. I've got the base on the spacers on the bench and the side in place getting ready to screw it together. I'm using Torx head cabinet screws to hold it together. I have found that the Torx head screws last much longer when they have to come on and off of the part. The simple alignment is that the sides overhang slightly, and I will dress that up as needed later, and screwing it in place with the 4 cabinet screws. I'll be using 2 or 3 clamps to hold it in place while I match drill and screw it in place. Putting a square up against the side, it's plain to see that they are not square with the base, and that is something I'm going to have to resolve later. I did not do a whole lot of planning on building this form, and I'm figuring that out as I go along. My original intentions were to install the sides and then sand them flush with the base. Once I got to this point with the sides installed and ready to install the ends, I determined I really don't have to sand them flat. I'm simply going to rabbet each edge of the end so that it goes in and sits up against the side. The corners will be caulked so it doesn't have to be close spacing, and this is just a concrete form. We're not building a piece of cabinetry.
Sure, this is visible in there. Sure, you can see that line.
My router rabbet jig did not exist at this time, so I'll be using the crosscut sled to help me cut this rabbet. Watch the router rabbet jig video I created about a year after this project was completed. Video link will be in the description and above. Setting up on the crosscut sled, I have a line drawn where I want the cut, and that will be the edge of the rabbet slot. Looking straight down on the board, I line up that line with the clearance cut that's in the crosscut sled, then clamp the stop in place. Once I'm set, I grab a scrap board and make my test cut.
Set it in place. But you didn't see.
It's supposed to be a 5/8 rabbet, and checking with the tape measure, just a little bit too small, so we're going to tap over the stop a little bit, making another cut, and see how everything lines up.
So again, we will loosen up the clamp, knock the bit.
I'll use a chisel to finish the rabbet cut, and then we'll go back to the base form and see how everything fits.
But holding it right at 5/8 is going to.
I tested and fine-tuned the rabbet cuts off camera, and now it's time to run the two ends, both sides, through the crosscut sled, cutting the pilot for the rabbet, and then off camera I will finish them out with chisels, and it's time to check and inspect the fit. The base of the mold is assembled, and I've got two clamps holding the sides in place into the rabbets, and using the square, everything shows that it is square. The question I have right now is, how am I going to do this when I pour the concrete, because I really don't want those clamps in that place. Also, if you'll notice, get a close-up view, there's a rather large gap where the rabbet was cut too deep that I'm going to want to resolve. As I was thinking about this at the time, I thought about putting a bracket across the top that basically just clips in place that holds the sides at a right angle. So we'll be looking at that later on. Also still to come is finishing off the surface of the base, filling all the holes, and I plan on putting a coat of fiberglass resin over that and polishing it out so that the concrete does not stick and breaks out of the form easily. Here's what I've decided to use to hold the sides at right angle to the base. Simple piece of plywood with a couple blocks on end that pulls it in right to where it's supposed to be. There will be one of these for each end. The feet index into the sides, and these two blocks here are plugs that form the groove that the feet index into. The feet will index into slots in the sides, and these two blocks are the plugs that form the slot that the feet will go into. The size and location of these blocks are critical. It is important that they are centered and the same distance apart. I have a spacer in between the two blocks, and also a spacer there in the right side. If I have everything cut right, I will be able to slide the spacer on the right side out and easily slide it into the left without anything moving, which will mean the two blocks are centered in the form. The first test indicated it's off just a bit. Grabbing a pencil, I put an index mark onto the base, and then here we can see it's off by approximately 1/32 of an inch. Although this may not seem like much to most of you, when building tooling, it is critical that you get it as close as possible to the design specifications. Any errors in the tooling multiplies the errors on the production floor. And although this really isn't a production part, the engineer within me cannot ignore the fact that this is tooling. After adjusting the size of the edge spacer, we can line everything up on the right side and then pull it out and see that it slides easily into the left side, meaning everything is centered. Now with this jig ready to set up the tooling, I can put in the 2 screws that will be holding those plugs in place. One down through the top into the base and one in through the end into the plug. And the last thing for these plugs will be to cove out the end that actually goes down on the base, because we learned with the feet they tend to get stuck if there's too much surface area. During this inspection, I noticed all of the voids in the edges of the plywood. This may cause some issues as the concrete flows into them and plugs everything up. So I've decided I'm going to do a little bit of rework and face these edges with some solid pine. I have the edging applied to the ends and the sides, and now it is time to resolve that gap that's in the rabbet. You might be able to see here where I have boxing tape applied to the end because I do not want the epoxy sticking to the end. I only want it inside the rabbet. Once the side is installed, I use boxing tape around the perimeter to cover up all of the edges. This is going to create a pocket for the epoxy to set in. It's important that the boxing tape is pushed up and pressed in tightly against all the edges so that the epoxy can't leak out. Depending on how deep the pocket is that I'm attempting to fill, I'll use either 15-minute or 30-minute epoxy. Never the 5-minute, because it sets up too fast to fill up the void. What I am using here is very old, and I'm just trying to get the rest of it out of the bottles. I just hate throwing things away. I'm looking into the side of the cup to estimate that I've got a 50-50 mixture. Once it is thoroughly mixed, I take small drops of it and place it at the top of the slot to be filled. Even though it is very thick, it will flow all the way to the bottom until it starts to set. Speeding it up just a bit, you'll watch it as it flows all the way to the bottom. And I just keep adding until it does not flow anymore and it leaves a little bump on the top, indicating that it is full. Now I put a square up to the inside and use a clamp to pull it in until the side is square to the base, and now that epoxy will set, giving me a nice firm surface to screw the board in, ensuring that it remains square. Now to let this corner cure and then do the same thing to the other 3 corners. Now a quick review of the form as it's in its current state of design. Here we have the base with the sides and ends assembled, and the 2 brackets sitting on top that will hold the sides perpendicular to the base. Shown here for the first time are the 2 plastic brackets that will be holding the tubes in place that are cast into the side for the bolts that hold the sides to the countertop. Just FYI, these are going to change later. And over on the other end are the plugs that are going to be creating the slots for the feet. Everything else shown here that's on top of the form is just debris used for creating the form. There's one more assembly that needs to be put together that makes up this form. It is shown over here as I pan across the shop to my other workbench. These are the plastic joints and the boards that will be making up the diamond-shaped opening in the legs. There's still a little more work to do to this before it's ready to install on the form. And that is coming up next. Now we're starting to assemble the diamond plug that goes in the center of the leg. First step of this is ripping the 4 walls of the plug. I have the table saw set which should be the correct width for the walls. The actual width of the walls does not really matter as long as it is the same as the width of the walls on the form. So first thing I'm going to do is get a piece of scrap and run it through the table saw and then compare it to the form. Once I have the test piece cut, I take it over and put it on the form, and using my finger gauge, I feel to make sure that they are the same height. Woohoo! Now that I've validated the table saw is set up correctly, I rip the 4 walls of the diamond plug to the correct width. Now it's time to get the center plug assembled. The diamond center plug consists of 4 walls of plywood and 4 plastic links that came from my 3D printer. Everything is held together with number 6 wood screws. I made the holes in the links too small for the screws, allowing me to use the screw to form a center for the pilot drill. I installed a screw about 1/8 inch or so and then followed with the pilot drill before fully inserting the screw. The driver bit skipped on some of the screws, stripping out the Phillips head, and why I prefer a Torx head style or square drive that are much more difficult to strip. Now that the diamond plug is fully assembled, it is time to get it mounted in the form. First thing I'm going to need to do before mounting the center plug is to find the center of the form. The easiest way to do that would be to draw an X using the corner of the forms, but to do that I would have to remove the sides, and I'm not going to want to do that at this time. So I put a square on one side and position it halfway from the end, then draw a line showing the midpoint. In actuality, this could be off plus or minus 1/4 inch and no one would ever notice, but I'm still going to get it as close as possible to center. Now that I have the vertical center line in place, it's time to put in the horizontal center line. I basically use the same process, but using a long ruler against the square because I don't have a square long enough. The width of the form is 22 inches, so I set it at 11 inches and then compare and make certain it is the same distance from the other end. The measurement of 11 inches is critical, but we do want to make sure whatever it is the same to the other side, and that makes certain that it is centered. Now that I have the center lines, I can use those to position and locate the center plug. I just positioned the center diamond plug by using the 2 center lines that were drawn on the form. Once the concrete is poured and set, this center plug is going to have to be removable. So to locate it on the form, I'm going to cut a couple of boards for the top and the bottom that will hold the plug in place so that everything can be easily removed. Or should I say, I hope they will be easily removed. I decided to use 1/2 inch MDF for the boards that are going to locate the diamond plug. I placed the diamond plug on top of a blank and then just transferred the lines and cut it out and sanded it to shape. Then I placed another piece of 1/2 inch MDF on top of the one I made and then just matched cut it. So now I have 2 identical stops. The only thing left now is to center the diamond plug on my crosshatch and then screw the stops down to the base of the form. Once the diamond plug stops are screwed down, the form is essentially complete and ready to get sealed. I plan on sealing the base using polyester resin used for fiberglass. Using wood filler, I filled all the screw holes and other damage to the face of the form. Typically, I've been using polyurethane to seal the forms, but this time I thought about experimenting with polyester resin used for fiberglass. After filling and sanding, I painted on a thin layer of the resin. Unfortunately, that video was corrupted. The letters A and B marked on the face are the locating tags for the diamond plug location stops. Although the stops were identical in shape, the mounting screws were match drilled, so I have to ensure they go back into the same location. Something unexpected happened. The fiberglass resin did not fully cure over the letters A and B and some of the larger knots. I tried searching for anyone else that may have had this problem and knew why, but I ended up finding nothing. Here you can see where I press a rag on top of the knot and it is still quite tacky. Does anyone out there understand or know why the polyester resin does not cure over knots or a black marker? To resolve this issue, I ground out the knots and filled them with wood filler, then threw another coat of fiberglass resin over the top. Up until this point, I've been sealing everything with polyurethane and having mixed results when breaking the mold from the casting. As you saw previously, I used boxing tape to mask and seal around where I used the epoxy glue as a filler and thought maybe that can be used for the concrete. Here I've got one of the ends of the form all finished and ready to go, coated with polyurethane. I glued a piece of pine across the top to eliminate hassles with the plywood laminates where the water and concrete could get in and cause problems. Although I don't think it's visible in the video, I marked a line across the face where it intersects with the base, and now I'm going to lay a piece of boxing tape across the face, which I'm guessing will be the perfect mold release since practically nothing sticks to this tape. Stripping a piece of tape off the roll, I laid it across the face against the previously marked line, allowing it to overhang on all edges. Then I used a plastic Bondo spreader to smooth it out, as it is important for there to be no wrinkles. The first attempt ended up with a wrinkle and I had to do it again. Any surface imperfections will transfer the casting and also may make it more difficult to take it apart. Once I have it trimmed to length, I fold the top edge over. I did this to all four sides of the form as well as the diamond center plug. We'll see later if it makes it easier to take the form apart. Here is the assembled form, and I thought I was done, but once assembled I noticed an issue. As we rotate around, we get a look at what was intended to be a plug to create a hole for the mounting hardware. Once the concrete was casted, I would drive that 1/2 inch tube out, leaving a hole for the 3/8 carriage bolt. Once I assembled the form, it became apparent that it was not going to be strong enough. Now moving over to the other one to see the change in the design. I have a tube with a couple of welded spokes that will make the attachment point much stronger. With this change, the tube remains casted in the concrete. I have a 3D printed pin screwed in from the bottom and the 3D printed bracket on top holding it in place. I'm confident this is going to be sufficient, but spoiler alert, another change will be coming. Backing out to see the whole form, you can see the plugs on the left side that will index the feet into the leg and how the diamond center plug is located with the A and B brackets. What is not seen here are the various pieces of rebar that will be added. That's the end of the leg form build with the exception of one more design change. The two carriage bolts that go through the legs must be in the exact same place as the holes that will be in the countertop. To make sure I get it right, I will be pouring a concrete plug into just the top end of this form and will use that to build the countertop. I lost the videos pouring this plug, but here is an image of the plug that was used to build the countertop. I did learn a lesson when I made the plug, and the lesson was that the upper locator brackets for the carriage bolt tubes had too much surface area that was not needed. The large surface area caused difficulty in getting the concrete placed under the bracket, so I made two new brackets that were much skinnier, making it easier to get the concrete placed. This is the end of this chapter. Be sure to subscribe to get a notification when I complete the videos for pouring the concrete for the legs into this form.